do this for Clifford Hawthorne. This is Charleston number 1.
Welcome back to Broken Bow Tapes. I'm your host, John P. Williams. Pull up a chair and let's see what's in the tape box today. Today's tape is called You Should Have Heard Gene. I've been hanging around Missouri fiddle contests, jam sessions, pie suppers, and ice cream socials since I was 7 years old and just learning the fiddle. Somewhere along the way, I realized I wasn't just collecting tunes anymore. I was also collecting stories. And one story, or maybe one name, just kept coming up. Gene Goforth. It didn't matter if I was talking to an old fiddler, someone in the crowd at an event, or someone who'd only met Gene once. They'd always smile, and then they'd say, "You should have heard Gene." It didn't matter if they had heard him 40 years earlier or the weekend before. They always smiled first. Then they told a story. I've probably heard 100 Gene Goforth stories over the years. Some of them are funny, some of them are unbelievable. Most of them are probably true. And the funny thing is, nobody ever starts with his contest wins or the records he made. They start by telling you what it was like to be in the room when Gene picked up a fiddle. I think there's a reason for that. You can read dates in a book, you can look up contest results, but you can't write down what it felt like to hear somebody like Gene Goforth play. So today, I'm not going to try to tell you Gene's life story. This episode wouldn't even come close. Instead, I'd like to tell you why, more than 20 years after his passing, Missouri fiddlers still smile when they say his name. One of the things most people sometimes miss about Gene is that he didn't just come from a musical family. He came from a family where it seemed like everybody played something. Gene was born in Shannon County in 1921, right in the heart of the Missouri Ozarks. His father, Richard, nicknamed Dink Goforth, was a respected local fiddler. His aunts and uncles played. 2 of his brothers played fiddle, guitar, banjo, and dobro. His sisters played guitar and bass. I've often tried to imagine what that house must have sounded like after supper on a nice evening. Music wasn't an event. It wasn't something you put on the calendar. It was just part of everyday life for lots of families in those days, but especially the Goforths. Now here's the part of Gene's story that has always fascinated me. Most people assume his father taught him to play. That would make sense, except Dink didn't. Gene remembered asking his dad about learning the fiddle, and Dink basically told him, "I'm not going to interfere. If you learn it, you'll learn it your way. It may even be better than what I'd show you." I've always liked that, not because it made things easier. It certainly didn't, but because it told Gene something important before he ever played a note. Find your way if you love it enough. So that's exactly what he did. He listened, he watched, he wore his ears out. The very first tune he learned was Black-Eyed Susie, just from listening to his dad play it. Nobody slowed it down for him. Nobody showed him where to put his fingers. He just kept after it until the tune finally came out of the fiddle. Funny thing about Black-Eyed Susie, you don't hear it nearly as often anymore. Everybody wants to learn Sally Johnson, Gray Eagle, Tom and Jerry, ad nauseum. But years ago, Black-Eyed Susie was one of those tunes nearly every old fiddler seemed to know. I've always wondered how many good tunes disappeared simply because somebody quit playing them. Maybe that's another story for another episode. One thing became obvious early on. Gene wasn't satisfied sitting around the house playing the same handful of tunes. If he heard there was a fiddler passing through Shannon County, he'd find him. If there was a pie supper, Gene was probably there. If there was a square dance, he was listening. Dr. Howard Marshall writes about a young Gene playing at pie suppers. When the older musicians took a break, Gene would step in and keep the music going with tunes like Rubber Dolly and the Paris Waltz. I love that picture. An 8-year-old kid standing in front of a room full of dancers, trying his best to keep everybody moving while the grown-ups caught their breath. Somewhere during those evenings, Gene stopped being a kid who was trying to play the fiddle. Gene became a fiddler. And before long, he started looking for the man who knew more tunes than anybody else around. His name was Roy Wooliver.
Got her? In
Before long, Gene had learned all he could around the house. Well, maybe not all he could. I don't know if anybody ever learns all they can around a family of musicians. But Gene had developed another habit. He'd heard there were other fiddlers out there, and he wanted to meet every one of them. That part of Gene's story has always resonated with me. I understand it, because if you're wired a certain way, hearing that there's an old fiddler over in the next county isn't just interesting, it's impossible to ignore. You start wondering, I wonder what tunes he knows. I wonder who he learned from. I wonder how many of those tunes I can remember before I get home. I don't think Gene was chasing famous fiddlers. I think he was chasing good fiddlers, and there is a difference. One name kept coming up, Roy Wolliver. Now, Roy isn't nearly as well known today as Goforth, and that's an absolute shame, as there might not be a more storied background than his. Because if you start tracing Missouri fiddling backward, Roy's name keeps showing up. Gene later said Roy knew more tunes than anybody around. That alone would have been enough to get a young Gene to seek him out. There was something else. Gene talked about the way Roy played. He said Roy could put a bluesy feeling into a tune unlike anybody else. I've always found that interesting. Gene wasn't just collecting tunes, he was collecting ideas. A bow lick, a phrase, a way to ease into a note. Those details are nearly impossible to write down. They're learned sitting across from another fiddler, watching, listening, trying it yourself, and probably getting it wrong a few times before you finally get it right. I've always thought that's one of the things that makes old-time fiddling different from a lot of other kinds of music. The notes are only half the story. The other half is everything that happens between the notes. That's the part Roy passed on to Gene. After World War II, Gene moved to St. Louis to work as a heavy equipment operator. Like a lot of Ozark musicians, he left home because that's where the work was. Thankfully, he didn't leave the music behind. He just packed it up with him. Those old tunes found new homes. Living rooms, basements, house dances, back porches, kitchen tables. Missouri fiddling didn't survive because somebody put it in a museum. It survived because people kept pulling their fiddles out after supper. I've always loved that idea of a simpler, less complicated time. You work all day, eat supper, and somebody says, well, let's play a few. Before long, it's midnight. Those gatherings became the classroom for a whole new generation of musicians. One of them was a young John Hartford. Most people know Hartford as a songwriter, or maybe as the fellow who wrote Gentle on My Mind. Around Missouri fiddlers, though, John was just another tune hound. He was endlessly curious, always asking questions, always carrying a tape recorder, always looking for one more tune, one more story, one more old fiddler to sit beside for an afternoon. And somewhere along the way, he met Gene Goforth. I don't think Hartford admired Gene because Gene was flashy. Quite the opposite. Gene had become exactly what his dad hoped he would become. He'd found his own way. Hartford recognized that immediately. He wasn't just hearing Gene Goforth. He was hearing Dink. He was hearing Roy Wolliver. He was hearing Shannon County. He was hearing the Ozark influence. He was hearing Saturday nights listening to Arthur Smith and Big Howdy on WSM. He was hearing generations of Missouri fiddling coming through one fiddle. And I don't think that was lost on him. In fact, it changed the course of his life. It also led to one of the most important recordings Gene Goforth ever made. But that's where I'd like to pick up next. One of the things about Gene Goforth is that he never seemed all that interested in making records. There are a handful of home recordings out there, but nothing flashy. In fact, Gene later said he wasn't especially fond of the Bluegrass Rounders album Strike Up the Bow. Felt it was too polished, and if you ask me, Gene is at his best on the recordings Dr. Howard Marshall made in Hannibal in the late 1980s. That's the Gene I hear people talking about when they smile and say, "You should have heard Gene." Gene was always more comfortable making music than making records. If you'd asked Gene where he'd rather play, I don't think he'd have said a recording studio. He probably would have picked somebody's kitchen, a house party, or a jam session after a fiddle contest. Fortunately, for the rest of us, John Hartford understood that musicians like Gene don't come along every day. Hartford spent years encouraging Gene to make a proper record. Eventually, He agreed. The result was Eminence Breakdown, released by Rounder Records in 1997. Hartford produced the album and sat beside Gene playing banjo just like he'd done so many times before. If you've ever listened to that record, you've probably noticed a few familiar names in the tune list. Roy Wolliver's Money Musk, Hamilton Ironworks. Those weren't just good tunes, they were also breadcrumbs. Little reminders of where Gene learned the music. Gene never acted like those tunes belonged to him. He always seemed more interested in making sure that they didn't disappear. A few years later, Hartford released what would become his final studio album, Hamilton Ironworks. Now, if you've ever listened to that record, I'd encourage you to spend some time with it. Not because it's flashy, it sure ain't polished, but it sure does sound like John Hartford sitting across the table from you, playing tunes, telling stories, remembering people. Throughout the record, he talks about Gene Goforth, Roy Wolver, and the Missouri fiddlers who shaped the way he heard music. That's one of the reasons I keep coming back to it. Not because it's a history lesson, because it feels like you're sitting in the room while John tells stories between tunes. And if you've spent much time around old fiddlers, you know that's where the best stories are told. I've been thinking about that a lot while putting this podcast together. When I was a kid, people told me, "You should have heard Gene." Now most of the people who said those words are gone. Gene's gone, John's gone, Roy's gone, but the stories are still there. The tunes are still here, and as long as somebody keeps playing them, they're never really gone. Maybe that's why I wanted to start Broken Bow Tapes, not because I think these stories are in danger of being forgotten. Quite the opposite. I think they're too good not to share. I'm John P. Williams. Thanks for spending a little time with me today, and until next time, if you find yourself disappearing down a musical rabbit hole, don't worry, I'll probably meet you there. Now let's pull another tape off the shelf.
Sure. Here's old time Billy Lowground.
Such as it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Be sure to check the show notes where you'll find free downloads of the recordings mentioned in this episode.